It's a privilege to be speaking to this conference on a topic that's near and dear to my heart, and I'm sure near and dear to the hearts of several of you in the room. How do we price electricity in such a way that will accelerate the energy transition? The energy transition, of course, is something that we are all familiar with. It's about mitigating climate change in an affordable way. So what I'll be doing in the next 20 minutes or so, I'll be discussing various ways of designing electricity prices. I'll be talking about electricity prices in the general sense of the term. They could be prices offered by competitive retailers, as well as tariffs that are offered by regulated networks. In most states in the United States, which by the way is not very united anymore, there is no retail choice, and electricity prices are designed by utilities and approved by regulatory commissions. Where retail choice exists, the consumer often gets a single bill from the retailer, and then it is up to the retailer to pass through the structure of the network tariff approved by the regulator. I understand that is the situation in Australia and New Zealand and a good part of Europe as well, and of course in England and Wales. The energy transition depends on the arrival of what people call the consumer of the future. Interestingly, such consumers have already begun to arrive. Their tastes are greener than those of the previous generation of consumers, and their houses have greener technologies in them, such as heat pumps that do both air conditioning and space heating, smart thermostats, electric clothes dryers, induction stoves, dishwashers with timers built in, and of course, electric vehicles and photovoltaic panels and battery energy storage systems, and very smart circuit breakers in place of the traditional circuit breakers. Of course, Australia is probably the world leader in photovoltaics, and so you are very familiar with that aspect. I understand electric vehicles are now also rapidly making their presence felt, and so are battery storage systems. So in many ways, Australia already has begun to go down this path. There are a wide spectrum of pricing designs today, and most of them feature time variation. There's the simple time of use rate, which has multiple periods in the daytime. They're known in advance, and the prices are known in advance. And then you have something slightly more sophisticated like critical peak pricing, where customers during the peak hours of, let's say, the top 15 days of the year face much higher prices because the system is stressed and conservation is at a premium. Then you have the flip side of that, where instead of charging a higher price, the customer has an opportunity to earn a rebate or a reward if they lower their usage. And then you have variations going all the way to real-time pricing or hourly pricing, which comes in many different varieties. There's also the three-part rate, which includes a volumetric energy charge, a fixed charge, and also a charge for peak demand. And then you have, interestingly enough, the resurrection of an old idea, which used to be called a fixed bill and now called a subscription plan, which basically gives you a guaranteed monthly bill. It doesn't vary month to month, and you know the number in advance. It's kind of like a generalization of prices offered by internet providers, by cable TV channels, and by Netflix. Some of these are widely deployed today. The simplest ones, of course, being in that category, the flat volumetric energy rates, fixed charges and flat energy rates, and energy charges that vary by season. Then you have the second column, where these tariffs are in the early stages of trials and deployment. These are the time-varying tariffs that I mentioned in the previous slide, demand or capacity charges, and subscription tariffs. And then you have combinations of these, by the way, that are being offered. For example, it's becoming increasingly popular to combine a subscription tariff with some kind of a rebate or reward for curtailing usage during times when systems are in critical supply-demand imbalance. And the ones that are in the third column are in the embryonic stage of conceptualization and trials. vehicle to grid, virtual power plants, hourly pricing based on marginal costs or wholesale market prices, locationally varying prices that reflect cost variations across the distribution network, and marginal cost pricing focused just on those technologies that accelerate electrification, like heat pumps and electric cars. All kinds of innovation is taking place after decades of lack of progress. The whole experience was so frustrating for me. 10 years ago, I was talking to a reporter from the New York Times, and he asked me to summarize the state of play. And I said, the state of play is frozen. And he said, why is that? I said, because regulators are frozen. Interestingly, that was the only line from that hour-long conversation that made it to the New York Times and resulted in me getting a call from the president of the Brat group where I worked saying, just calm down. So we have 400 trials now with time-varying pricing designs that allow us to predict their likely impact on peak demand. And we can go into this in greater detail if time allows, but at a high level, the simplest form of a time-varying rate is a time of use rate, or TOU. If the peak price is 2.4 times higher than the off-peak price, you'll get a reduction of 5.9% in peak demand. But if you combine a smart thermostat with that rate design, so it's automatically responding to the change in price, by the way, I have one of those, then you get a 10.9% reduction in peak demand. And then you have dynamic pricing, which is much higher peak prices and much lower off-peak prices, and you get much more significant impacts from all of those. Now, the good news is, what was yesterday's bad news, lots of failures and mistakes, is today's good news and tomorrow's excellent news, because we can learn from the blunders that we all made in the past. For example, the biggest blunder was to not engage with stakeholders in the tariff design process. These are the consumers, trade allies, interveners, and influencers. By influencers, I mean socially high-profile individuals that have nothing to do with electricity, but they're well respected by the public. They could be politicians, they could be cricket players, they could be musicians, they could be anyone, fashion designers included. Another mistake that was made was the peak period to be longer than 8 hours. Nobody wants that. No human being that I know wants that. And so there's a few other blunders listed here. We can come back to those during the discussion period, the fireside chat. By the way, I wouldn't worry about the lack of fire, because every time that occurs, the discussion creates the fire in the room. Only 10% of consumers today in the US are on time-varying rates, even though 80% are on smart meters. It's somewhat disappointing and depressing, but there is good news, because we are now beginning to see progress. A few states are leading the way: Arizona, California, of course, which is my home state, Colorado in the Rocky Mountains, and then Oklahoma, Maryland, and Michigan. And in some states, they're making time-varying tariffs the standard tariff or the default tariff. That includes California, Colorado, Michigan, Missouri, New York, and Hawaii and Minnesota are also looking into it. One utility in the US, a small utility, a municipal, in Fort Collins, Colorado, with 50,000 customers, actually has mandatory time-varying rates. And there has been no rebellion, there has been no shouting or screaming. The secret to success is education, education, and education. And you take your time, you prepare the customers, you show them the opportunity. The opportunity is not to pay a high price, which sometimes we have tended to advertise the high price, which is a blunder, but instead to advertise the lower price, the discounts, what all retailers do when they sell clothing and so on. And then you have opt-in time-varying rates, which today really have a very low enrollment rate of 1% or less, because they were poorly designed. They didn't appeal to customers. Now, we have one state, Illinois, which includes Chicago, where 2 investor-owned utilities offer real-time pricing, but it's not a very exciting program. And even though it's been offered for more than 15 years, the enrollment rate is very low. Of course, the world is beginning to change, the world of time-varying rates. Ontario, Canada, default time of use rates. They've had this before anyone else did in North America, so hats off to them. Quebec, Canada today, which, as you know, is a very cold area, they surprised me by offering CPP and PTR on an opt-in basis, and the results have been very encouraging even in a cold climate like Quebec. Great Britain is seeing a lot of innovation with companies like Octopus arriving on the scene. My sister lives in London, and before I even heard of Octopus, she already had signed up to their rate called Agile Tariff. She has solar, she has batteries and an EV, and they're saving money on it, and they're also helping the system. In Europe, all of a sudden, in the last 2 or 3 years, I've truly been stunned. They're offering hourly pricing now, the retailers. And I have a chance to go there in April, England and Spain, and I hope to see what's really happening there. It's a vacation trip, but on the side, I'll check that out by talking to Uber drivers and so on. And then, of course, Australia, I mean, you really surprised me and impressed me very much when this dynamic operating envelopes came out. The surprise was because the acronym was DOE. And as you know, in the US, the DOE means Department of Energy. So initially I was confused. Then I realized it was being offered as a very dynamic export tariff by Osgrid. And so far as I can tell, it's very successful. I'd like to hear more about it at some point. Now, one of the benefits of time of use rates is that it can lower the operating costs of electrification. It can encourage consumers with solar panels to pair them with batteries and then use the battery to avoid straining the grid during the peak period. As a prosumer, I have done that as well, and really enjoying it, the savings, and the utility is enjoying the savings from my not putting much of a load on their grid during the peak period. TOU rates also lower the cost of charging EVs, as you can imagine. And a lot of my friends, neighbors, and relatives who for years got tired of me talking about time of use rates and why you're not on time of use rates, they got a car, an EV, and suddenly they're on a TOU rate. And then they say, oh, now we know what you were talking about. So when the consumer sees the benefit to themselves, then they take the action. Previously, they would just tell me, and now we can understand why the utility wants to do a time of use rate, lower peak load, but that's not my problem. That's their problem. Why should I do their job for them? And they might lower the cost of running heat pumps as well. So to target electrification, particularly in high-cost areas, I have been talking quite a bit lately that we should use marginal cost pricing, which is lower than average cost, which are the traditional rates today, but target them on specific loads and offer the rate as a two-part rate, where part one is your standard rate, whatever it is, and standard usage. And if you don't electrify, your bill is just what it was. So there is no panic attack on the part of the customer, and there is no panic attack on the part of the retailer or the network. They'll still get their revenue. Part two, however, is based on marginal costs, which are lower than average costs for most utilities and regions of the globe. And those are targeted, those tariffs are targeted at customers who electrify, heat pumps and EVs being the primary vehicles for doing it. And as a result of that, I believe society will benefit through lower carbon emissions. The world will be better off since climate change will be mitigated, and there'll really be no losers. It'll be what economists call a Pareto optimal policy. Of course, to succeed, rates should be designed to enhance affordability, which I understand is a major focus of this event. The best option, of course, is to lower the cost of service so the rate level is as low as possible. California, of course, is a violent exception here because the cost of service has been rising radically over the last 2 decades. According to one estimate I saw, it's risen by 300%, even though peak demand has been flat. So something is not going well. It is not the customer who installs solar who's causing it, which is the allegation by some parties. It is just managerial inefficiency and a failure of regulation. For a given rate level, once we have arrived at the given rate level, the best way to enhance affordability is through the tax code. Give low-income customers a tax credit. But oftentimes that is not a top priority with governments and legislators. So the next best way which I've argued sometimes, is to offer energy stamps. So in the US, we have something called food stamps. If you're low income, you get a certain amount of buying power, purchasing power through a government issued food stamp. So I have said, why don't we start issuing energy stamps? Energy is just as important as food for many people, for most people. And then, of course, the last option, which is the most popular option today, is to offer a discount to low-income customers. In California, the discount is 35%. Who pays it? Every other customer. And so it creates equity issues. To succeed in reforming prices and tariffs, of course, requires that we find common ground among stakeholders. Stakeholders are consumers, environmentalists, other groups, et cetera, all of them typically will have a different view of what's the objective of rate design, with some saying maximize economic efficiency, others saying minimize peak load growth, and others saying lower bills. So what we need to do is have a process of stakeholder interaction where we allow them, through a nominal group technique, to air their concerns about what are the objectives of rate design, and then to discuss with them which rate design is best suited for which objective, and then finally use a scorekeeping method to find a consensus as to this group met, and they think these are the most important rate designs. And of course, you need a facilitator or a moderator to the process who is not one of the stakeholders. So conclusions, this is a very high level conversation, but I hope I touched a chord with you on some of these issues. The energy transition requires customers to electrify their homes and to rely as much as possible on renewable energy, clean energy. To facilitate the customer adoption of electrification, new pricing designs are needed. We have to just jettison the past and move on to the newer ones. The good news is they are being tested, have already been tested, and rolled out in many different parts of the globe. I worked on 6 continents in my career, and not everyone is moving as fast as Europe, but a lot of them are certainly moving. And we hope that this process will now sort of contagion will develop, and it will be a global positive contagion. To achieve success, we have to include all stakeholders in the pricing design process, and I've shared with you some ideas on how to create consensus among stakeholders. I've applied that method in Asia and in the US and Canada, and it usually produces a surprisingly positive outcome. So I'm going to stop here and let you begin, I guess, the fireside chat. Thank you.
So I have a lot of questions for Ahmad and for Sally. I think maybe the one that really struck me from your conversation just now, Ahmad, is you talked about the consumer of the future, but you actually talked about technology of the future. And so I grant it that technology is changing. Are people changing? And do we have good evidence for that? Our most recent consumer energy report card demonstrated that about half of customers, 54% of customers, just want a simple, just want to pay a simple, fair price for energy. And you sort of yourself talked about how there's 80% of smart meters in the US, and yet only 10% of customers have taken time variant rates. Do you think that people are changing, or is it just technology?
That's a great question. People are changing slower than technologies at a slower pace. There is no doubt. But once you have an EV, as I mentioned, once you have solar, once you have battery storage, you begin to think hard about ways to optimize your bill. But yeah, that's a small percentage. California is an exception. Much of the US, not much is happening. So what I am saying is I'm still calling them the consumer of the future, and I'm recognizing the reality that the consumer of the present has to be attended to as well. So when we make these transitions towards the newer tariffs, I want to make sure that it doesn't make the existing consumers worse off just because some of them became innovative and with their technologies and their tastes. So that's a balancing act, and that's why the marginal cost pricing that I'm proposing is only targeted at those consumers who are ready to electrify with EVs and heat pumps. And I'm coming up with an algorithm here that will protect the other consumers from having to pay higher bills. Again, it's an evolution and not a revolution.
Yeah, and I appreciate that we've got a wide audience out here today, a beautiful audience that you can't see, Ahmad, but we've got some people who are pricing boffins and can talk about PTR and CPP and all of the rest of it. But I think, but we've got probably the other half of people are less engaged in this conversation. And so I'm just going to spend a minute, I think, to try and explain it from my perspective, which is one energy price is the most visible price in the economy. Everybody here, or many of you, would know roughly the price of petrol today. The last time I checked, for E10, it was an arm. For premium, it was the cost of your firstborn, right? But that's why I drive an electric car. But that price, everybody knows and is very visible. We know that it's per liter. I would guess that most of you don't know the price you pay for electricity, despite what you do for a living. And our research says that about 20% of customers actually know what tariff they're on. And those are probably the same 20% who know what a tariff is. So most consumers don't really know. And so just in the US, and in most of the examples I think you're talking about, Ahmad, customers, in one sense, don't have choice. Because like you, for an example, right, my understanding is that your utility is Pacific Gas and Electric, and you can't choose another retailer. But you do have choice between all these different types of rates that you are identifying, or the different ones that they offer. And so the challenge with that, historically, the issue with that model is that it won't promote innovation. But when I look at it, it seemed like you used a lot of fancy words and 8 different rate types. It sounded like a lot of innovation to me. The downside of our model in Australia, where you do have consumer choice, is that you don't have that same regulation of the full retail price. We regulate the price for networks, the price for the poles and wires, but not the full retail price. So Sally, this one's for you. Do you think that competition has worked to deliver, our second target over there, that everyone pays a fair share for the energy that they use?
Hopefully this is working. Hi, it's nice to see everybody. Thanks you for having me today. I am probably one of those boffins that you talk about, so I will try to be as simple as I can. Look, I think it's a great question, and I've been around for a long time in the energy reforms, back when we were first designing the rules and the regulations and the law. And, we made really decisions that we thought were really important at the time around using regulation to look after network tariffs and applying regulation to the monopoly part, and using competition to get the right outcomes for consumers in the retail market and the wholesale market. Now, there was a lot of economists around at the time that believed in the theory of competition, as I do, and I still do. But I think what we've observed is competition hasn't done the work that we expected it to do. So we expected competition to provide a diversity of products and services. We expected competition to compete away margins. We expected competition to deliver to consumers what consumers want. And I think what we've seen is that that's not really that's not working the way we want. So I'm going to take a minute just to talk about our pricing review, because this is one of the key issues that we're looking at. is regulation still doing the work that we need it to do to deliver consumers, and is competition doing the work that we expected it to do to deliver to consumers? So the AEMC is undertaking a price review where we're starting at, you know, what do consumers want and what do they deserve? What are the products and services that consumers need for in the future energy system? And then we're working back and saying, well, what are the barriers or the things that are stopping that from happening, and where in the supply chain is that happening? So are there barriers between the retailers and the competition that mean and consumers that means that consumers aren't getting what they deserve, and where are the barriers between network and retailers, and how does that interface matter? So if we expected network regulation to deliver lower costs and better products, to support retailers to deliver lower costs and better products, where's it going wrong? So that review will be looking at those important questions about if we're looking at efficient tariff design, and we use cost-reflective network pricing, and sometimes I think we forget probably two important things. One is that efficient pricing? And number two, does it really matter whether a consumer gets a signal or a retailer gets a signal? Because the idea behind competition is that it allowed the retailers to compete and manage the risk, so consumers didn't have to. So the answer is no, I don't think that competition's doing the job that we wanted it to do. And I also think that there's some work that we can do in the design of regulation to support the retailers to deliver the diversity of products and services to consumers. So we've released a consultation paper on that, and we're looking at having a directions paper in April. I'm really keen to hear people's views about what those blockers are and how we can better design solutions for those. And I know Ahmad and I have had a few conversations about the work that competition and regulation can do, both in the vertically integrated market where the retail product is regulated, and also in if you don't have the retail product regulated, what do you need to do in network tariffs to provide the platform for retailers to do their job. I'll stop there.
Well, that was great. Thank you, Sally. And I think there's probably a lot of commonality across the room about, your comments about whether or not competition is delivered for consumers, because I think, a lot of people are still suffering and trying to understand whether or not they're getting a fair deal, and it doesn't feel like they are. Ahmad, ECA's objective, part of our objective in our Constitution, is to be collegiate and evidence-based, which is something I love about working here. But so you cite a lot of evidence in one of those slides about the reduction in peak demand, which is the most amount of energy that a customer uses, from time of use rates or time variant rates. Do you have any insight into whether or not that reduction in peak demand is decreasing the cost of the network, the poles and wires, or is it decreasing the cost of wholesale generation, the cost of power plants? Any insight where most of the benefit from those rates is coming?
Most of the benefit, as far as I can tell, is coming from the generation cost. I have not seen any studies that show what has been the impact of these rates on network peak loads. We would have to see those studies before we can conclude whether the network costs have gone down or not. And, there is this reverse swing, to use a cricket term, that sort of crept in with EVs that are now showing up in large numbers in certain regions, and they're all charging during the off-peak hours. They're saving generation costs for sure, but some of them are actually raising distribution costs. Transformers are blowing up, circuitry is overloaded, and so utilities are not providing permission to buy EVs in certain areas because of distributional constraints, and that's led rise to this new movement to have managed charging, where the distribution aspect of life will be recognized using advanced technology. And then you get into an Orwellian debate where some customers say, no, I don't want to keep it plugged in all the time, and I cannot rely on you to know when I need the car. I could suddenly have a need for a car at midnight if an emergency happens, and if it's plugged in and not fully charged, what do I do? So we are running into new territory, which is the distributional costs. And if I can make one comment on your previous question, that was a great question. So in areas of the world where there is no retail competition and rates are high, like in California, people are calling for retail competition. In other areas where there has been retail competition for a long time, like the UK, people are fed up with whatever is available through the competitive model. And I have been comparing notes with Professor Littlechild, who was one of the first to liberalize the UK market, and even he concedes the point that there is no panacea. Everyone wants to have the opposite of what they have, thinking that somehow they will be better off. But it's like a phantom movie, really. Reality is very difficult to decode.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me and sounds true. And I think, I guess the solace in that is effective reform can maybe happen in the margins here where we don't have to actually try and go back to a vertically integrated system, which is probably unrealistic. So one of the things that came up in the discussion yesterday was there was a debate about the role of taxes versus tariffs. And one of the insights I took away from that discussion was that there actually needs to be a combination. In all instances, there's going to be a combination of taxpayers funding complementary measures, which can be incentives for more efficient appliances or weatherization, can be concessions for low-income consumers, plus tariffs. So given that, and you talked, Ahmad, although I'm going to ask you the question, Sally. Ahmad, you talked a little bit about who needs to be in the room to have a good pricing discussion. Do we need government in the room and because of the role of complementary measures and to make sure that we're really looking out for all consumers?
That's just me. I think this is one area where I'm not sure I'm totally on board with Ahmed on whether or not we need to have consumers in the room to talk about tariff design. I probably feel like at one level that's a job that governments and market bodies and economists should do, and we shouldn't expect consumers to care or engage with tariff design. I think it's our job to think about tariff design to reduce the total overall cost of the system, and how do we do that? But I think it's also our job to ensure that there's a variety of products and services and different tariffs available to consumers so they can choose whether to engage or not to engage, whether to respond or not to respond. So I think the most important thing is, and the question in our review is economists like to send efficient pricing signals. And the reason for that is you either change or you pay. I mean, that's the bottom line, right? That's why we design tariffs the way they do, so that those that can change and we can get a lower cost system, and those that don't change pay and pay more. And I think that model has not necessarily served consumers very well in the past. And so it's about, well, who needs to get the signal and what signal are we sending? So in Australia, of course, Ahmed, as you know, we look at network and retail separately. So if you look at the network signal, what signal do consumers need to have to reduce the overall cost of network business? Now, I can tell you 100% I am not going to change or move house so I can respond to a locational network signal. I am not going to do that, and I pretty much challenge everyone in the room that they're not going to do that either. So then the question is, if you're going to have a locational signal, you really just got to accept that that means people pay more, right? So then it's sort of what other signals do networks need to send? So there is a congestion impact, but if you look at the percentage of costs in the network tariff, it's quite small. We already have compromise in network tariffs. We have quite high variable charges despite quite high fixed costs. So that signal is not very effective, even if people responded. So then you look at the retail tariff and the retail. So you're talking about risk, you're talking about wholesale costs. So that's a much stronger signal, which potentially swamps the network, efficient network tariff signal at the retail end. So I think we need to think about that. Like if the outcome of non-response is paying more, and we know as an industry over 25 years, even though as economists, lawyers, engineers in the room say a better outcome is government comes in and provides support packages for those consumers that need it, we haven't seen that. So we need to take responsibility for those outcomes as an industry, and that's what we're trying to do. But we need to think carefully about whose responsibility is for tariff design versus whose responsibility is to deliver the outcomes to consumers. So, you know, I've been on a bit of a journey as a really strong economist over my career to understand that responsibility and equity and understanding really what the behavioural response is so important to those discussions.
Thanks, Sally. I really want to ask a question about gas prices, mostly because there is a looming issue on consumers from electrification. You talk about these sort of win-win opportunities from electrification, and I agree, but there's an unintended consequence from electrification, which is the households who remain on the gas network are going to face really high gas network charges, and there's not a great solution to that problem. A quick plug that ECA recently, just last week, submitted 4 rule changes to try and, on the margins, improve consumers' fate in that debate, but it's a tough problem, and our rule changes won't solve the issue, but hopefully they'll make it marginally better. But I want to jump to the questions from the audience. There's a fantastic one up front. Some research finds time of use tariffs have inequitable impacts on low-income households. Where CER is not accessible for all, how do we ensure energy equity and justice? Ahmad.
All right, so that's an age-old question, and certainly it's a very big question in California. Just today, I was invited to go and speak at the Senate on that question, and I got out of it. I didn't want to testify before the Senate. Who needs that as a retired economist? But basically, it's a politically loaded question, without a doubt. And the way to deal with that is not to go after the customers who have CERs. They installed CERs because electricity was very expensive. They had no other option. And for years and years before they installed CERs, they were large customers. They were subsidizing the small users. Nobody takes that into account. All right, so let's now come to your specific question, which is they have installed it, they have lowered their usage, maybe they're not paying their fair share of costs, right? That's the allegation, and therefore rates are being raised for everyone else. Well, the way to deal with that is to make CERs affordable even for low-income customers, to subsidize if needed by governments so that solar, electric cars, and batteries are affordable to everyone, as opposed to putting a tax on customers who have done CERs and using the reverse Robin Hood argument. Again, it's a loaded question, and I certainly have strong views, so maybe I should stop there.
Sally, anything you have to add?
I think one area that I think Ahmed and I both agree on is, you know, there is some benefits where there can be response at sort of sending a signal to consumers. And I think with the CER resources, there's still some benefits in doing that. But then we've got to look at the bigger picture, right? So if we really want to bring down the whole cost of the system so all consumers benefit, we want to stimulate the CER assets. So, you know, there are some benefits to all of having more CER integration and stimulating CER. So I do think that that's an important part of the solution, not just a part of the problem. And tariff design to date probably hasn't assisted that as well. So I think there is a responsibility for us to do that. And just like you mentioned, Ahmed, I think, you know, when we think about the vulnerable consumers, we've got to think about whole of consumer solutions, not just a pricing signal. And one of the things that Ahmed and I've also talked about is the potential to use rebates and incentives to get people to change behaviour rather than just penalties through pricing. And that may extend to the future in providing people with opportunities to engage with the system, reduce their own bills, lower their own usage, and benefit from selling electricity back into the grid. So if you look at it a whole of consumer point of view rather than just the cost of providing those sorts of assets, then, you know, they're options I think we should put on the table, not just look at it as if we can only solve this problem through pricing, because we need to look at incentives, we need to look at improving comparable information, and we need to make sure that it's easy for consumers to make choices in a simple and low-cost way.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, there's a lot of evidence that actually suggests that I think CER can sometimes be a misleading term because we bundle too much together. But certainly electric cars, rooftop solar, in early installations of rooftop solar definitely, and energy efficiency bring down total system costs because they reduce the cost of generation and network services in many instances. And so the idea, there is, that customer obviously is seeing a lot of benefit, but their neighbors should be receiving benefits too through if prices are efficient. So but we have to find ways to make sure that those consumers who don't have CER and probably will never get it. Some customers are just never going to get. I live in a flat. It's difficult for me, right? So there have to be ways to make it fair and reasonable for everybody. Anyway, great discussion. Thank you so much for coming, Sally. Thank you for teleporting in, Ahmad. And I'm sure you will all join me in thanking the panelists.